Cisco routers store their configuration information in configuration files. When you boot the router, it loads the startup configuration file saved in the router's NVRAM into RAM. The copy of the configuration file loaded into RAM is the running configuration file. The router actually uses the settings in this file. Any changes you make as you configure the router appear in this running configuration file. The changes take place immediately, but are not saved. Thus, the running configuration file may actually be different from the startup configuration file. When you shut down and restart the router, the running configuration file in RAM disappears. When you turn the router back on, it simply uses the startup configuration file to make another copy for RAM. To save your changes permanently, and to load different versions of the configuration files from various locations, use the copy command in privileged exec mode. Let's look at using the copy command. The most important concept to remember is that the syntax for the copy command is always copy from here to there. For example, suppose I have made several configuration changes that I want to save. To do this, I use the copy command to copy the contents of the running config file to the startup config file. The syntax for this command is copy running config, startup config. We now need to supply a file name for the configuration file. Notice that the prompt includes startup config in brackets. This is the default file name, and to accept it, we simply press enter. The router builds the configuration file, and our changes are saved in NVRAM. When the router boots again, it will use the new startup configuration file. You can also store backup copies of the configuration file on a TFTP server. Again, you use the copy command. Remember, the copy command is always copy from here to there. When copying to a TFTP server, the router prompts you for the IP address or host name of the TFTP server. It then asks for a destination file name. After executing the command, a copy of the configuration file is stored on the TFTP server, so you can reload it when needed. So, how do you reload a configuration file from a TFTP server? Again, use the copy command. In this case, we'll load the config12 file from the TFTP server into the router's NVRAM as the startup config file. The router again prompts for the TFTP server's IP address, as well as the source and destination file names. Use the copy command to manipulate configuration files in various ways, from saving, to backing up, to loading alternate versions. When using the copy command, remember the syntax, copy from here to there. Cisco routers use the configuration register to determine where they should load the IOS at startup. By default, the router loads the IOS image stored in flash memory and the configuration file stored in NVRAM. However, you can add entries to the configuration file that specify alternate IOS image locations. A Cisco router can load an IOS image from flash memory, ROM, or a TFTP server. Use the boot system command in global configuration mode to configure alternate boot locations. The boot system command has the following syntax: boot system, followed by the file system location, followed by the IOS file name. If your router has enough flash memory, you can store multiple IOS images right on the router. The command shown here will load the IOS image named iosback1 from flash. To load an iOS image from a TFTP server, use the boot system command, followed by the keyword TFTP, followed by the iOS file name. When using a TFTP server, you also have to specify the server's IP address. The third location for loading the IOS is System ROM, which contains only a limited version of the IOS and is typically used only as a last resort. By default, the router will use the ROM IOS if it can't find it in any other location. The line shown here adds the boot system ROM statement to the configuration file. Depending on the iOS version, you will use the boot system ROM or the boot system flash bootflash command. Most iOS versions will automatically translate boot system ROM to the correct format for you. Each time you use the boot system command, you insert a new line in the configuration file. Each line specifies where to look for the iOS image. For example, when this router boots, it will first look for the iOS image with this name in Flash. If it can't load that file, it will look in the location specified by the next boot system command in the configuration file. If it completes all lines and still hasn't found a valid image, it returns to the default iOS load sequence. To review, an iOS image can load from one of three locations: Flash, a TFTP server, or ROM. By default, the router will use the first iOS version found in Flash. Use the boot system command to specify alternate locations of the iOS. If they exist, boot system locations are checked first. If they are not found, then the default locations are checked.